In 2025, Israel is once again surrounded by conflict. Yet instead of seeing its economy collapse, its GDP per person has climbed to around $55,000, placing it among the wealthiest nations in the world. How does a country under constant security threats continue rising while others in conflict tend to sink? Three forces define the answer: U.S. financial and diplomatic backing, a defense and cybersecurity sector that earns billions, and a society balancing growth with sharp demographic pressures. In fact, just last year, Israel set a record with $14.7 billion in defense exports. War usually destroys economies. Here, the opposite has happened. Why Israel's wealth is so surprising? That's what makes the question so striking. For most countries, prolonged conflict is a recipe for poverty, not prosperity. Wars usually dismantle economies. Industries stall because workers are conscripted or displaced. Currencies lose value as governments print money to cover spiraling defense budgets. Foreign capital retreats, businesses shrink, and rebuilding takes years, even decades, after fighting ends. In short, the standard pattern is contraction and hardship. Israel's path diverges sharply from that pattern. By 2025, its economy produces about $55,000 in wealth per person, with IMF and World Bank estimates placing it somewhere in the low to mid $50,000 range. That puts its living standards on par with developed European nations such as France and the UK, an outcome few would expect from a state repeatedly drawn into crises. While Lebanon, Iraq, and other neighbors saw sustained economic decline after years of fighting, Israel steadily climbed into OECD territory. The paradox is that instead of collapsing under the weight of conflict, this small country managed to channel instability into a long-term footing for growth. This isn't simply luck or a temporary side effect of regional volatility. Israel deliberately built a system where military needs and economic activity reinforce each other rather than compete. Defense research, skilled labor shaped through universal service, and an innovation-driven private sector together created an environment where war pressures do not erase prosperity. Yes, consumer demand dips in moments of crisis, and foreign investors sometimes hesitate, but the overall trajectory remains positive because the entire economy has been engineered for resilience. That leaves the real puzzle: what forces allow Israel to bend these economic rules when so many other nations cannot? One answer lies beyond its borders. For decades, an external partnership has reshaped Israel's ability to grow under pressure, ensuring that the usual financial penalties of conflict rarely strike as hard as they do elsewhere. Without that support, the story of Israel's wealth might look very different. The U.S. partnership shield and lever. Since the late 1960s, Israel has drawn on decades of American partnership in the form of military and economic support, an arrangement that has totaled well over $260 billion. Depending on how you calculate inflation, some estimates place the cumulative figure closer to $320 billion. Few nations have ever received such a consistent and large-scale pipeline of assistance, and the reliability of that aid is as important as the headline dollar figure. Unlike countries that must constantly balance wartime budgets under extreme stress, Israel enters each year knowing that a large portion of its defense costs will be handled externally. Most of the modern allotment comes through military channels, with the 2016 Memorandum of Understanding setting foreign military financing at $3.8 billion annually, supplemented by separate appropriations for missile defense initiatives. For a country facing recurring conflict, that structure transforms both its budgeting and its strategic choices. This arrangement shifts Israel's economic options in ways few other wartime states experience. A sudden escalation in a typical conflict-driven economy means borrowing heavily, issuing new currency, or cutting basic services to cover military bills. In Israel's case, Washington underwrites much of the defense purchase program and co-finances development projects. Instead of draining national coffers, those funds cover fighter aircraft contracts, missile systems, and advanced research programs jointly run with American firms. Freed from carrying those costs alone, Israel can keep investing domestically in areas like education, infrastructure, and high-tech industries. The economy is not locked into perpetual crisis mode. It has room to plan strategically. The partnership, however, is not measured only in dollar flows. The second layer is political. Israel lives in a region where hostile votes at the United Nations or sanctions campaigns could at any moment endanger access to global markets. Here again, consistent U.S. influence changes the calculation. Washington's use of diplomatic weight and veto power has often stopped attempts to impose broad restrictions that would otherwise disrupt trade or foreign investment. This diplomatic umbrella is vital to sectors that lean heavily on exports and outside capital. For firms deciding whether to sign contracts or inject billions into Israeli companies, the knowledge that the United States will generally block measures threatening those activities becomes a decisive reassurance. That political cover is often as valuable to investors as the aid dollars themselves. If such protection were lacking, the risks would look very different. Just one sanctions regime could shrink Israel's defense exports dramatically. Foreign venture capital might pull back, spooked by legal uncertainty or the chance of being cut out of markets. Pension funds and institutional investors might rule out involvement entirely. In that environment, Israel's startup nation brand would carry far less weight, especially during spikes of violence. Instead of a rush of capital flowing in, global partners would hesitate or take their money elsewhere. U.S. backing doesn't guarantee immunity from downturns, but it reliably lowers the ceiling on how bad those downturns get. For companies and funds, that conditional stability is enough to keep the long-term commitments coming. When you compare this to other states under heavy security pressures, the difference in trajectory stands out. Lebanon's financial powerhouse in Beirut largely unraveled once regional conflict and instability stripped away foreign confidence. Iraq and Iran, both oil producers capable of great wealth, saw their prospects diminish sharply under decades of sanctions. Israel's alignment with Washington has created an unusually secure environment in which capital treats rockets or regional flare-ups as long-term irritations rather than existential risks. Investors in Silicon Valley or European capitals monitor the headlines, but with U.S. protection in place, they rarely feel compelled to abandon their positions. That acceptance of risk, tempered by American guarantees, is part of the foundation supporting Israel's economic resilience. It is crucial to stress, though, that this external support does not directly generate Israel's economic innovations. Aid does not invent new agricultural technology or design artificial intelligence systems. Those outcomes depend on domestic institutions and workers. What U.S. assistance does is amplify the environment in which those innovations can thrive. Constant backing ensures that an escalation won't wipe out the financial system or shut down trade routes overnight. By flattening the extremes of economic volatility, American influence effectively magnifies the payoff from each Israeli innovation, making bold experiments and aggressive growth strategies viable even in wartime conditions. This effect is most visible when foreign investors assess risk. In most countries under conflict, venture capital would hesitate during flare-ups, unwilling to stake millions on a territory that might face embargoes. In Israel's case, those investments rarely stop. Deals continue to be signed for cybersecurity companies linked to military units or agricultural firms pioneering water-saving technologies. For these investors, Washington's political guarantee acts as a stabilizer. They may accept the day-to-day volatility precisely because they believe larger geopolitical barriers will not suddenly close the economy off from the world. The alliance extends into operational cooperation as well. Joint military projects, such as the development of layered missile defense systems, use American financing and expertise to multiply Israeli capacity. These arrangements let Israel field advanced technologies at lower costs, while also integrating the lessons from those projects into civilian industry. The cycle is efficient. A defense program bankrolled in part by the alliance creates breakthroughs, and those breakthroughs often migrate into commercial markets like cyber protection or communications. Without a great power partnership underwriting the development risk, building these systems at scale would simply be cost-prohibitive. U.S. assistance also shapes expectations in subtler ways. Domestic companies inside Israel react differently to escalations because they, too, expect recovery. That expectation is based on experience. Each downturn in recent history has been cushioned by external backing, with markets stabilizing faster than outside observers predict. The psychological stability, businesses assuming they will ride out turmoil, reduces the kind of panic selling or sudden capital flight that amplifies recessions elsewhere. Markets respond not just to fundamentals but to perceptions, and the knowledge of long-term American partnership shifts those perceptions in Israel's favor. This ongoing relationship influences global credit ratings as well. International agencies assess the likelihood of repayment not only by reviewing tax bases or growth rates, but also by factoring in geopolitical alignments. Knowing that the world's largest economy has repeatedly committed to Israel's financial and military survival reassures creditors. The result is easier access to affordable borrowing, even when conflicts are acute. In contrast, isolated states under sanctions often face skyrocketing rates or find themselves frozen out of lending altogether. For Israel, the combination of resilient fundamentals and reinforced trust keeps infrastructure, education, and research projects funded even under stress. Broadly speaking, more than 50 years of consistent cooperation has built two interconnected safety nets. On one side, military and economic assistance absorbs costs that would otherwise overwhelm a small nation engaged in near-permanent conflict. On the other, diplomatic cover keeps trade lanes open and capital flowing. Together, these create a unique shield that allows industries, whether a Tel Aviv startup, a Negev farm, or a Haifa technology lab, to function inside a more stable framework than external conditions would predict. For a country so often at the center of conflict, the impact of that arrangement cannot be overstated. Yet while this support structure is critical, it does not fully explain how Israel turns continual insecurity into a source of growth. Dollars and diplomatic backing set the stage, but the next question is how specific industries have transformed danger itself into an economic asset. Defense technology turning threats into exports. A key example of this transformation is Israel's defense technology industry, where the demands of survival have become the foundations of a thriving export market. What in most countries ends as an enormous cost has, in Israel's case, been reshaped into a sector generating steady streams of foreign revenue. By 2024, the Ministry of Defense reported record export contracts worth $14.7 billion, with totals in the 2024-25 period hovering around $15 billion. For a country of roughly 9 million people, that figure signals how central arms and security technologies have become to the economy, lifting Israel into the ranks of the world's top defense exporters. The process through which domestic threats evolve into commercial products follows a direct pipeline. An urgent need generates experimentation, that experimentation produces a working prototype, and once tested under real conditions, the system is adapted into an export good. Take missile defense. The Iron Dome system began as a desperate project designed to shield cities from rockets. After proving reliable in combat, it became a flagship export, sought after by countries as diverse as the United States, India, and several NATO members. Here the logic is consistent. The state's survival requirements yield solutions that, when scaled, become attractive to other militaries. Recent data shows a further evolution in this market. In 2022 and 2023, exports of rockets, missiles, and air defense systems surged to dominate the portfolio, while unmanned aerial vehicles, which once took a larger share, declined proportionally. That shift illustrates how Israel monetizes exactly the types of threats it faces most often. As rocket salvos from Gaza or southern Lebanon grew frequent, producers refined interception technologies. Those improvements not only protected Israeli civilians, but also created hardware other nations were eager to purchase. The balance of Israel's export composition reflects this cycle of need translating directly into trade. The role of artificial intelligence inside these systems underscores another feature of the industry. Israeli missile defenses are not just hardware launchers. They incorporate software that weighs trajectories, calculates probability of impact, and selects which incoming threats merit interception. Sophisticated algorithms reduce unnecessary launches, conserving expensive missiles. This efficiency principle is then bundled into the export package. Buyers understand they are acquiring not only physical interceptors, but also embedded predictive systems that maximize effectiveness. Likewise, drones with AI-enhanced navigation and targeting, first perfected for border patrols, are adapted into global sales lines, from reconnaissance platforms to armed UAVs. Civilian spin-offs from this research deepen the impact. Cybersecurity is the clearest example, where engineers protecting military communication links against constant intrusion developed techniques that later migrated into public markets. Encryption advances, anomaly detection tools, and monitoring frameworks, originating in defense labs, underpin products now installed in banks, airlines, and hospitals worldwide. This explains why Israel became a global hub for cybersecurity firms. War-borne techniques translated into commercial systems millions of people rely on daily. Next to cyber, surveillance is another area where military platforms evolved into policing and border control technologies. Contracts for such systems have expanded to clients from North America to Southeast Asia, showing how once local innovations transformed into valued international commodities. This deliberate integration between military and economy explains why defense exports feed the broader system, rather than remain isolated. Israel Aerospace Industries, Rafael Advanced Defense Systems, and Elbit Systems rank among the country's largest employers, sustaining tens of thousands of jobs. Their production chains include subcontractors, local tech startups, and collaboration with multinational corporations. Crucially, foreign buyers value the combat-proven status attached to these systems. Unlike weapons developed in countries with long procurement cycles and limited battlefield use, Israeli platforms are refined under continuous pressure. They are seen as credible, tested against real-world attacks rather than only simulated environments. This credibility strengthens Israel's position in the global defense market. Nations purchasing Israeli systems perceive them as high-value solutions with clear records. Rather than devoting years to hypothetical evaluation, buyers can examine logged performance from active conflicts. In economic terms, this accelerates the sales pipeline and cements Israel's role as a supplier of timely, battle-tested technologies. The benefits extend well beyond sales. Export contracts inject hard currency, stabilizing Israel's balance of payments. They attract joint ventures with foreign firms, spreading Israel's design influence across multinational supply chains. Each deal helps bind Israel deeper into global industrial and scientific networks. Defense contracts thereby not only bolster employment, but also cultivate long-term integration with international partners. In 2024 alone, deals spanned Europe, Asia, and Latin America, showing how widely Israeli systems now circulate. Economically, this model provides resilience. Each escalation creates disruption, but also sparks new problem-solving. Analysts often describe Israel's economy as unusually adaptive. This is because repeated crises continuously generate new military challenges: cheap drones, cyber-sabotage, improvised rockets that companies solve, export, and scale into foreign contracts. Where conventional theory would predict spiraling costs, Israel manages to convert those costs back into revenue. The structure of this model relies on the dual role of government and private enterprise. Military demand forms the guaranteed initial market. Private firms then adapt each order into slightly altered forms designed for external buyers. The dependence of local industry on that first government commission cannot be overstated. It de-risks development, ensuring prototypes reach scale. Yet once systems are upgraded into exportable models, firms capture profits abroad. This coupling of state necessity with business opportunity has few parallels. Some argue the morality of such a system is questionable, that conflict should not be a driver of profit. But in pure economic terms, Israel's defense industry has shown how sustained insecurity can be transformed into capital. Each major conflict produces new weapon classes, protection systems, or digital solutions, which in turn travel wider globally. In 2024, Israel sat alongside powers like France, Russia, and the United States in annual defense export rankings, a remarkable achievement for a small state. The scale of this industry matters at home as well. Defense firms provide stable, high-wage jobs and continuous streams of tax revenue. In a global sense, Israel's economy would look quite different without these contributions. The $14–15 billion in annual defense exports represent not just weapons sales, but the foundation of several of the country's most influential companies. Firms such as Elbit and IAI rank among the top global defense contractors, but also operate as multi-purpose industrial hubs. Their innovations spin off into commercial planes, satellites, and medical devices, showing how an economy built around conflict also feeds civilian sectors. This is the payoff. A nation that should by all logic struggle under the cost of permanent defense has leveraged those same costs into one of its central export pillars. Israel is now firmly among the leading arms exporters worldwide, with defense serving as both protector and economic engine. Few other countries integrate survival and profit to the same degree, and this integration explains much of Israel's resilience in hostile circumstances. But defense hardware is no longer the only field where these patterns appear. In recent years, the battlefield has expanded into areas visible not on city streets, but inside networks and data streams. And in that domain, Israel has again turned necessity into influence. AI and cybersecurity, the new battlefield for growth. Wars in the 21st century are increasingly fought through data, algorithms, and digital networks rather than just tanks or aircraft. This shift is already transforming both security and economics, and Israel sits near the center of it. Just as earlier conflicts pushed the country to pioneer missile interceptors and surveillance drones, today's pressures have driven a focus on artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. These are no longer peripheral tools, they form the backbone of modern defense. Heavy weapons still matter, but without advanced software to process threats, coordinate responses, and defend networks, even the most sophisticated systems lose effectiveness. Israel's advantage lies in having embedded AI and cyber capabilities directly into its national defense and commercial sectors. AI has become a fundamental layer in Israeli military operations. Missile defense batteries now integrate predictive software that tracks launches, calculates trajectories in seconds, and assigns interceptors with minimal waste. Surveillance platforms rely on algorithms to scan endless feeds of visual and electronic data, flagging anomalies that human analysts would miss. While these tools are built for defense, their software-driven nature makes them highly adaptable for export. Constant refinements, distributed through updates, allow buyers abroad to acquire systems that improve over time, making Israel's product line appealing for militaries seeking tested and scalable solutions. Drones offer another clear example. Israeli industries have developed a range of autonomous and semi-autonomous models. Some focus on long-duration reconnaissance, staying airborne over contested areas and transmitting information without requiring constant human control. Others carry strike capabilities, guided in part by AI-assisted targeting systems that reduce reliance on real-time piloting. Although humans remain responsible for ultimate decisions, the degree of machine support has expanded rapidly. These platforms have become attractive on the global market, with buyers across Europe, Asia, and the Americas seeking cost-effective drones backed by battlefield experience. Each sale not only delivers revenue, but also reinforces Israel's position as a leader in intelligent unmanned systems. Cybersecurity has created perhaps an even larger economic ripple. For decades, Israeli networks have been subjected to near-constant attacks from both state actors and independent groups. Defending against these pressures led to the rise of specialized military intelligence units, most prominently Unit 8200. The unit's alumni have played an outsized role in shaping the private sector. Many of the country's top cyber entrepreneurs come directly from this training pipeline, entering civilian life with operational experience that is difficult to replicate in academic programs. This flow of talent explains why such a small state has generated a disproportionate share of the world's cybersecurity firms and technologies. The trajectory of companies born out of this environment illustrates the pattern. Check Point, which became a global leader in network security, began with technology linked to defense challenges and later found applications across governments, corporations, and financial institutions. Similar stories repeat with dozens of firms. Small teams of veterans build solutions first tested under military pressure, then adapt them into commercial products for international markets. Venture capital follows this pattern because investors recognize that these founders have already worked against some of the most complex adversaries in the world, providing credibility that accelerates growth. The dual role of these technologies, domestic survival and international commerce, amplifies their importance. Inside Israel, AI-driven defense systems and network protection tools form the backbone of resilience against routine attacks. Outside its borders, these same technologies provide scalable exports across every sector that depends on digital infrastructure. Global demand is nearly universal. Banks, hospitals, airlines, and governments all require secure networks, making the customer base far broader than that of traditional defense hardware. This universality turns niche solutions into mass-market products, extending Israel's economic reach. Software-focused industries also operate under different economic dynamics than hardware-heavy sectors like arms manufacturing. A missile defense battery may cost billions and take years to complete, but a cybersecurity platform can be replicated and deployed worldwide at comparatively low marginal cost. This scalability makes profits grow rapidly once a core product proves effective. It also lowers entry barriers for new firms. Former intelligence officers can leave service and within a few years run startups valued at hundreds of millions, precisely because their outputs are digital solutions rather than heavy machinery. In this way, Israel's innovation cycle is faster, cheaper, and more adaptive than in many other countries. That constant churn of talent has become one of Israel's defining advantages. Unlike other advanced economies that rely heavily on universities or long vocational pipelines, Israel compresses training into military service under high-stakes conditions. Young conscripts in elite intelligence programs spend years solving real-world cyber problems, gaining hands-on expertise. The result is a pool of workers who, upon leaving the military, are industry-ready without requiring decade-long academic paths. Global investors understand this feed of talent and actively target Israeli startups as a result, funneling capital into ventures that can quickly build world-class tools. The economic weight of these industries is substantial. High-tech and ag-related activity now account for roughly 18–20% of Israel's GDP and more than half of its exports, according to recent economic reports. This concentration is unusual for an economy of Israel's size and underlines the degree to which digital technologies, much of it rooted in defense needs, sustain growth. In effect, conflict has not only compelled Israel to innovate, but has given it a competitive niche in the global economy that compounds over time. Concrete examples show how the cycle repeats itself. A military demand for secure communications develops into encryption software. That software becomes the core product of a startup. International banks adopt it, driving revenues and further R&D. The improvements then feed back into defense networks, reinforcing security at home. Each stage strengthens the next, creating a feedback loop of innovation and commercialization. Investors are particularly drawn to this momentum, since they see steady returns backed by urgent demand both in Israel and globally. By exporting knowledge as well as platforms, Israel has positioned itself not just as a supplier but as a standard setter. International clients increasingly frame their digital security in terms influenced by tools and doctrines born in Tel Aviv or Haifa. This gives Israel leverage well beyond material exports. It embeds the nation in global practices, ensuring long-term relevance even as technologies evolve. Each new crisis on its borders or in its networks produces refinements that, in turn, find their way into products used worldwide. In the broader sweep of its economy, the success of AI and cybersecurity firms demonstrates how Israel has been able to turn instability into structured growth. Revenues and exports expand regardless of temporary downturns, sustained by the universal need for secure systems. Unlike heavy industries that fluctuate with political cycles or commodity swings, digital solutions maintain global demand. The constant risk that drives innovation at home ensures a steady flow of new companies and products abroad. What emerges is a picture of a small nation that has managed to fuse military necessity with economic opportunity in a uniquely productive way. Conflict is not only absorbed, but transformed into an environment that fosters economic expansion. The industries tied to AI and cybersecurity contribute directly to national defense, while forming one of the most profitable export categories in the global economy. This foundation sets the stage for yet another layer of growth. Beyond large defense firms and established cybersecurity giants, Israel's economy has cultivated an unusually dense base of small, fast-moving companies that drive a significant share of its GDP. These firms take the same culture of urgency and adaptation forged in conflict and apply it to commercial technology far beyond defense products. This dynamic has made one aspect of the Israeli economy stand out internationally and adds another pillar to its resilience. The Startup Nation Engine. Israel's reputation as the startup nation is not just a catchy phrase but a measurable reality. Despite its small population, it produces more startups per capita than any other country. By 2025, these firms contribute around 18–20% of Israel's GDP and generate more than half its exports. For most economies, such a heavy concentration of output from fledgling companies would be unstable. In Israel, however, the density of startups provides agility. Instead of growth depending on one major industry or natural resource, it comes from thousands of small experiments. Many fail, but enough succeed to push the economy forward. That variety ensures that downturns in one sector rarely derail the whole system. In a setting marked by conflict and unpredictability, that flexibility functions as a type of insurance policy. The origins of this system trace back to how Israeli society trains people at a young age to handle complexity and uncertainty. Military service, often viewed outside Israel as purely a defensive task, doubles as a large-scale skills program. Conscripts enter units where they are required to solve problems under constant stress, operate advanced technologies, and lead small teams. These experiences resemble the conditions a startup founder faces: tiny resources, extreme time pressure, and high consequences for failure. This is why many of the country's most successful entrepreneurs begin their careers in military intelligence or technology divisions. Two outcomes make this pipeline unique. First, it produces veterans with skills, technical knowledge, leadership under pressure, and operational discipline that are directly applicable in building a startup. Second, it creates credibility in the eyes of investors. A founder who arrives with experience in an elite unit is seen as someone tested by real-world crises. Foreign and domestic investors often cite this background as proof that a team can perform in high-stakes business environments. This perception has become so entrenched that instability, which scares capital away in most regions, is treated here as a sign of product strength. International investment has reinforced the growth of this system. American venture capital firms and European funds routinely back Israeli startups even in the midst of regional conflict. The logic is that if a company is run by people accustomed to high-pressure environments, their ability to navigate uncertainty extends to business challenges. With capital flowing, startups scale rapidly, hiring aggressively, entering new markets, and securing global partnerships. This flow of investment means the 18–20% share of GDP derived from high-tech and startups is not a ceiling, but a steadily expanding base. Concrete examples highlight just how valuable this model has become. In 2024, Google announced its $32 billion acquisition of Wiz, a cloud security startup founded by Israeli entrepreneurs with defense backgrounds. For perspective, this was one of the largest cybersecurity deals ever recorded, illustrating the scale of companies emerging from Israel's ecosystem. Deals like this draw headlines not just for the sums involved, but also for what they signal: that Israeli firms can grow from small teams to global leaders in a matter of years, powered by the unusual mix of military training, cultural risk-taking, and international funding. The conversion of military technologies into civilian opportunities is also systematic. Tools originally built to monitor networks for infiltration evolve into corporate cybersecurity products. Systems designed for battlefield logistics are reworked into supply chain management software. The process is not accidental but embedded in the structure of Israel's innovation culture. Each military challenge produces prototypes, and the dense startup ecosystem ensures those prototypes are frequently adapted for civilian markets. This cycle gives Israel a steady supply of globally relevant products while insulating the economy from over-reliance on a single market. Culture shapes this model as much as technical expertise. The willingness to embrace failure is unusually widespread. In many countries, a collapsed startup can mark the end of a career. In Israel, failure is viewed as a learning step that builds toward eventual success. Founders routinely launch multiple ventures, investors continue backing entrepreneurs after early exits or collapses, and society at large tends to frame bold experimentation as a form of responsibility rather than recklessness. This cultural environment lowers the cost of risk-taking. The result is an endless churn of new companies, some of which ascend quickly to international relevance. Supporting structures extend this momentum. Universities supply technical depth, often linking research labs with entrepreneurial projects. Government programs connect emerging firms to global markets and offer tax or infrastructure incentives. Multinational corporations establish research branches inside Israel to benefit from its talent base, further integrating domestic startups into global supply networks. The result is not simply a country with many small companies, but a complete innovation system where education, military experience, public policy, private capital, and corporate presence are mutually reinforcing. From an economic standpoint, the system's resilience stands out. Most countries cannot afford to rely heavily on startups because the failure rate is so high. In Israel, continuous inflows of trained talent and sustained investor interest keep the funnel of new companies replenished regardless of economic cycles. Failures are absorbed because the flow of new ventures never stops. This dynamic ensures that the contribution of startups remains large and persistent even during seasons of political instability or open conflict. The deeper lesson lies in how the society systematically links its national challenges with economic opportunity. Risk, adversity, and instability are not merely endured, they are reframed into training opportunities and entrepreneurial credibility. The result is an economy that leverages instability into a method for producing wealth, not just an unfortunate backdrop for it. Startups in Israel represent more than a business sector. They are proof that conflict-driven pressures can fuel innovation when embedded into social and institutional structures. Understanding this, it becomes clear that Israel's wealth is not built on one advantage alone. Defense exports and cybersecurity have created global markets, while the startup system converts personal experience from national service into economic output. Each lever interacts with the others, multiplying effects across industries. As a result, Israel delivers growth outcomes that defy conventional expectations for a country under near-constant geopolitical pressure. Yet high-tech is not the only front where adversity becomes a source of advantage. Away from software firms and venture capital, another set of industries has developed quietly and with equal impact. These industries address fundamental survival needs, resources that most countries take for granted but which Israel has always lacked. Their expansion shows that the same playbook of turning scarcity into expertise applies well beyond digital technology. Beyond war, agriculture, water, and survival tech. Israel's global standing is often framed through its defense exports or high-tech startups, but another set of industries tells a quieter yet equally important economic story. Beyond weapons and software, Israel has become a leader in survival technologies, methods for producing fresh water from the sea, cultivating crops in arid conditions, and managing resources under scarcity. These fields do not generate the same headlines as missile systems or cybersecurity, but they are essential for understanding how the country sustains prosperity. What began as survival imperatives, finding enough water, producing enough food, has grown into an export sector with global demand. Water was the most pressing problem from Israel's earliest years, when rainfall and limited rivers proved insufficient for the growing population. The state pursued desalination not as a futuristic option but out of necessity. Plants constructed along the Mediterranean coast now supply much of Israel's domestic demand at costs that have fallen steadily with technological improvements. Once secure at home, Israel began exporting both infrastructure and expertise. National firms moved into overseas markets, providing desalination capacity in countries facing similar shortages. Today, these firms are seen as reliable suppliers of turnkey systems, and their work extends to regions in Africa, South America, and Asia. Global demand is expanding as rainfall variability grows more severe under climate change, positioning Israel strongly in a sector where few countries have such proven capacity. Agriculture faced the same restrictions. Large parts of Israel's land were never suited for European-style farming, so the state approached cultivation as an engineering problem. Drip irrigation emerged as the defining solution. Rather than flooding fields, water is released slowly at the roots of plants, improving yields with a fraction of the water input. That innovation kept Israeli agriculture viable and quickly became an international export. Farms in India, Kenya, and Mexico have adopted these systems to make previously marginal land productive. In parallel, Israeli research institutions develop salt and drought-resistant seed varieties. These crops tolerate high temperatures, limited water, and poor soils, helping ensure food supplies even in fragile environments. Both irrigation systems and seed technologies remain staples of Israeli agricultural exports today. The scale of these exports is significant for a country its size. Agricultural products themselves contribute more than $1.3 billion in foreign revenue annually, while agricultural inputs and technologies, such as drip irrigation systems, precision sensors, and agri-tech software, account for roughly another $1.2 billion. Together, these numbers highlight that agriculture is not just a domestic accomplishment, but a recognized global industry. Unlike military equipment, these technologies sell across both developing and advanced economies. European countries incorporate Israeli irrigation to conserve water, and American firms partner with Israeli tech startups to modernize farm management. For Israel, this makes agriculture and water technology stable, long-term sources of foreign income. There are concrete reports of how these exports function internationally. In India, partnerships using Israeli irrigation and crop management have been credited with increasing smallholder yields and reducing inputs, supporting millions of rural farmers. African states facing repeated droughts have adopted drip systems to stabilize food production under uncertain rainfall. Although the precise numbers vary by region, the reported benefits are consistent. Israeli technologies improve efficiency and reliability where traditional farming has failed. These contributions reach beyond profit by mitigating humanitarian pressures such as famine, migration stress, and economic instability. The universality of water and food needs distinguishes these industries from defense sales. Defense contracts can be politically fraught, with restrictions on buyers and diplomatic considerations. By contrast, irrigation equipment or desalination plants are rarely controversial. Countries that would hesitate to import Israeli arms are willing to adopt its survival technologies. This has allowed water and agricultural exports to function as instruments of soft power. Partnerships in Asia, South America, and Africa often begin with technical support and evolve into broader diplomatic engagement. Where defense strengthens alliances with existing partners, survival technologies open doors to entirely new relationships. The industries also show how Israel's innovation system extends outside the military. Early government investment in desalination and irrigation targeted immediate national needs. Universities added research capacity, refining systems scientifically. Private companies grew to scale and carried the products abroad. Each stage of the pipeline depended on the others, creating a tightly integrated network that proved highly effective. That integration helped Israel maintain its position as a trusted provider, while competitors in other regions often struggled to coordinate between state, research, and commercialization. Just as importantly, survival technologies diversify Israel's export base. Defense and high-tech remain critical, but they depend on markets that can shift with political conditions. Agricultural and water products face much steadier demand. Rising global populations, accelerating climate change, and intensifying water scarcity make these markets dependable. Even if geopolitical conditions reduce arms transfers, Israel can rely on exports of irrigation systems, seeds, and water technologies to sustain revenues. In this way, survival tech acts as a hedge against volatility in defense-dependent sectors, anchoring a second major pillar of the economy. By 2025, these industries are no longer seen as secondary. Startups working on water recycling systems, vertical farming, and data-driven crop analytics have joined the traditional drip irrigation and desalination firms. Global contracts bring consistent foreign revenue, and the worldwide demand curve points upward rather than sideways. Agricultural exports already exceed $1 billion annually, and agricultural input and technology sales are firmly above that threshold as well. Together, they form a foundation of economic independence built not on abundance but on efficiency. The strategic advantages are clear. Instead of being known only for weapons or cybersecurity, Israel cultivates an additional identity as a problem solver in fields central to human survival. That role expands export revenues, deepens ties with foreign governments, and provides soft power leverage in global forums concerned with development and sustainability. With demand rising predictably, these sectors reinforce both financial returns and international trust in Israel's capacity to provide practical solutions. Taken together, water and agricultural technologies highlight a broader principle. Prosperity in Israel has grown as much from overcoming natural scarcity as it has from managing conflict. Economically, they diversify the portfolio and stabilize revenues. Politically, they create low-sensitivity markets and diplomatic openings, crucial for maintaining resilience. Socially, they demonstrate that innovation in Israel is not confined to warfare or digital industries, but extends into the everyday fundamentals of survival. Yet even with strong export pillars in defense, digital technology, and survival industries, Israel's economy faces pressures from within that these successes alone cannot resolve. Rising GDP masks structural strains that build up beneath the surface, and those strains now form one of the country's biggest long-term tests. The demographic challenge. Israel's prosperity is often measured in exports, innovation, and growth, but beneath those numbers lies a demographic challenge that threatens to reshape the economy's long-term trajectory. The issue is not only about production and investment, but about who will form tomorrow's workforce. Ultra-Orthodox and Arab households are growing quickly, and both groups are overrepresented among the poor. Within the Ultra-Orthodox community in particular, male labor force participation remains well below the national average, even as their population share increases year by year. The effect is structural. A rising segment of the population contributes less to taxable income while relying more heavily on state subsidies. Family size amplifies this trend. In many ultra-Orthodox households, 6 or more children is common. On one level, this ensures population growth that strengthens Israel's demographic weight regionally, but it also magnifies fiscal pressure because large families consume more in public services. With many men devoting their adult lives to religious study rather than paid employment, household incomes remain low while subsidies and allowances expand. Over decades, this produces a widening mismatch between where Israel's economy creates value, technology, engineering, and global-scale innovation, and where its fastest-growing communities invest their time and skills. The imbalance stands out when compared to Israel's economic identity. A nation celebrated for technical ingenuity and high-value exports faces its strongest workforce growth in communities that underparticipate in science, math, and English education. Many ultra-Orthodox schools emphasize religious studies over subjects aligned with the modern economy. The result is a talent gap. High-tech firms need engineers and programmers, but the group that is expanding most rapidly in the population produces few candidates ready for those industries. Over time, if the labor pool tilts too far away from these skills, Israel's innovation-driven resilience becomes harder to sustain. Politics complicate the problem. Ultra-Orthodox parties have repeatedly become decisive partners in coalition governments. As a condition of supporting ruling coalitions, they secure funding for religious schools and subsidies for large families. For governments reliant on tight majorities, cutting or conditioning this funding is politically difficult. The impact is clear. While defense spending grows with each regional escalation, another significant set of resources is ring-fenced to sustain communities with lower workforce participation. That combination narrows budgetary flexibility and locks government spending into obligations that do little to relieve wider pressures, such as healthcare, infrastructure, or housing. For many analysts, this arrangement functions as a fragile contract. The secular and economically active majority pays a disproportionate share of income taxes, while perceiving that others contribute little to either the army or the economy. As long as growth continues, this uneven distribution is tolerated. But when living costs rise or wages stagnate, frustration grows. The sense of imbalance is not just fiscal but social. One group bears the military service burden and the bulk of tax revenue, while another, increasing in size, avoids both. Such divides risk fueling long-term resentment that strains social cohesion. Housing adds another dimension to the demographic challenge. Tel Aviv frequently ranks among the world's most expensive cities, and prices across Israel's major urban centers have surged far beyond wage growth. The average young household, even with 2 earners, often cannot afford to buy a home. Population growth driven by large families intensifies that demand, while limited land keeps supply tight. Rental markets offer little relief since rents track the same upward curve. For many young Israelis, including those employed in high-tech, the squeeze of housing costs erodes disposable incomes and restricts future stability, making the headline statistics of prosperity feel disconnected from daily life. The contradiction deepens when statistics of success meet lived experience. GDP per capita places Israel alongside advanced Western economies, but domestic stress points tell another story. Young families carrying military reserve duties and paying some of the highest taxes in the OECD also face housing costs that rival London or New York. The result is that national prosperity feels like an abstraction, distant from the financial reality of securing housing or raising children. As resentment filters into debates about subsidies and labor participation, the demographic challenge becomes intertwined with questions of fairness and intergenerational equity. Analysts warn that the long-term sustainability of growth is at stake. If larger population shares do not integrate into productive employment while demanding more in subsidies and housing support, the fiscal load shifts onto a smaller base of contributors. That limits the state's ability to invest in innovation or public infrastructure, the very tools that underpin global competitiveness. At the same time, mismatch between rising costs and limited opportunities could encourage emigration of young, skilled workers. Brain drain of engineers or entrepreneurs would weaken the innovation engine exactly when the system most needs reinforcement. This is not a sudden crisis, but a slow-moving trend. The expansion of the ultra-Orthodox community has developed steadily for decades, and the fiscal strain rises gradually rather than dramatically. Still, international observers point to the long-term risk. Organizations like the OECD and Israeli research institutes such as the INSS emphasize that the issue is not whether Israel is prosperous now, but whether the tax base and workforce skills of the future will be sufficient to maintain prosperity. The logic is simple. Each year that participation remains low, the eventual choices become starker. Either increase participation through reforms or raise taxes on the sectors already carrying the system. Both routes create social pressures, but history suggests postponement compounds the cost. Policy suggestions tend to converge on one approach: expand workforce participation through targeted education and conditional funding. Some analysts call for reforms in religious schools to add core subjects like math and English, ensuring future graduates can access employment in advanced industries. Others argue that state subsidies should be linked to participation, encouraging gradual integration into the labor market. These proposals are not about erasing religious tradition, but about ensuring that demographic growth is matched by economic contribution. The consensus among economic researchers is that this is the practical path forward, though political conditions make consistent implementation difficult. Wartime dynamics make reform even harder. When national security is on the line, coalition stability becomes more important than fiscal reform. Leaders rarely cut subsidies in periods of heightened conflict for fear of breaking alliances when unity is critical. This creates a repeating cycle. In calmer times, there may be talk of reforms, but once security tensions rise, political priorities shift. The result is delay, and over time, delay ensures that structural pressures keep building quietly even as headline GDP figures stay strong. The absence of visible collapse allows policymakers to defer action, even though the risks are cumulative. In the bigger picture, demographics and housing underscore why prosperity cannot be taken at face value. The story of Israel's economy is not just about exports, startups, or military technology, but also about whether the burden of sustaining that system is shared broadly enough to last. The rapid growth of underparticipating populations and the cost of living squeeze for young workers present long-term risks that are harder to measure than quarterly GDP data. They matter because they shape whether the foundations of resilience remain intact for generations ahead. Even so, it is important to view these challenges within context. They are not immediate threats that erase Israel's current advantages, but they represent structural limits that could erode resilience over decades if left unaddressed. The paradox is clear. An economy designed to function under external conflict faces some of its most serious risks from internal imbalances that grow quietly year after year. And while these domestic pressures accumulate slowly, external shocks arrive without warning. Each new round of conflict still disrupts markets in ways that numbers alone cannot conceal, reminding Israel that even resilient economies are not insulated from the immediate costs of war. When war disrupts the economy, war has defined much of Israel's modern history, and while its economy is built to recover and adapt, each round of violence disrupts daily life and leaves measurable costs. Resilience should not be confused with immunity. Every conflict introduces uncertainty that hits fragile sectors first: tourism, household spending, foreign investment, creating shockwaves that sophisticated planning and foreign aid cannot fully prevent. The long-term growth story remains intact, but underneath, the short-term damage is visible and cumulative. Tourism shows the vulnerability most clearly. In normal years, millions of travelers support hotels, airlines, restaurants, and small businesses across Israel. When conflict breaks out, bookings collapse almost overnight. Flights are canceled, airport passenger traffic falls sharply, and hotels empty. Prolonged escalations turn once busy tourist centers into ghost neighborhoods. The lost income does not return later. A canceled trip is a permanent loss to the service economy. Each interruption strips revenue from an industry worth billions of dollars annually and undermines Israel's image as a safe destination, compounding the economic hit. Consumer behavior within Israel changes in parallel. Households tighten spending once security concerns rise. Non-essential purchases, dining out, shopping, cultural events decline, weakening the domestic demand that normally fuels growth. Anxiety and uncertainty push families towards saving rather than consuming, and small businesses feel the strain first. Even with strong average GDP levels, disposable income sits idle when residents sense instability, dragging down the multiplier effects that usually support employment and service industries. Consumption does rebound, but the repeated stop-start pattern prevents more consistent growth in local markets. Foreign investment also slows when fighting escalates. Large international companies with existing facilities rarely pull out, but new projects often pause. Venture deals stall, risk committees postpone approvals, and capital inflows ebb. This delay disrupts the flow of venture funding and partnerships that Israel's tech sector depends on. U.S. aid and diplomatic backing blunt the worst-case scenario, wholesale withdrawal of foreign capital, but even modest pauses matter. For industries built on rapid scaling and constant financing, weeks of delay can weaken momentum, diluting overall growth potential. The downturn following October 7, 2023 underlines the scale. In the quarter immediately after the attack, some estimates calculated that Israel's GDP contracted at an annualized rate near 20%. This was not a long-term trend, but a sudden collapse in activity as firms struggled with labor shortages, international travel dried up, and consumer confidence slumped. Recovery followed, but the sharp contraction demonstrated in numbers what is otherwise seen only in disrupted businesses and quieter streets. The cost of war is sudden, deep, and unavoidable even for advanced economies. The mobilization of reservists magnifies these impacts. Israel's defense model requires calling large numbers of civilians into duty, pulling skilled workers out of the labor force sometimes for months at a time. Engineers vanish from startups, teachers leave classrooms, technicians depart factories. Projects stall, deadlines stretch, and productivity suffers. Analysts noted during the 2023 conflict that a significant share of the workforce was absent. Businesses stretched remaining employees to compensate, but many could not. While reservists eventually return, each call-up removes capacity at a time when demand for stability is highest. Manufacturing and logistics sectors reveal the strain in practical terms. With staff diverted to service, production slows, supply chains falter, and international orders accumulate delays. Export-oriented firms, which normally sustain the balance of payments, lose critical output weeks. The same is true in retail and services, where reduced staffing forces shorter hours and weaker performance. These missed earnings rarely reappear later to balance out. Instead, they become a recurring drag visible in the gaps between Israel's strong growth trends and the slower pace of output during conflict years. Construction ties these disruptions to broader social tensions. Reserve duty among contractors and workers stalled major building projects in 2023, worsening shortages in a housing market already strained by surging demand. Delays push deliveries of new homes further into the future, extending price pressures for buyers and renters. Here, the economic cost intersects with daily life, intensifying a housing crisis that young families already struggle against. Interruptions in building are temporary in nature, but feed into structural problems with lasting consequences. Financial markets respond with a pattern that looks predictable: sharp drops during conflict followed by resilience once fighting subsides. Israeli stocks fall, currencies face pressure, and bond yields fluctuate. But markets know the playbook, and confidence is gradually restored as routines resume. Even so, volatility is not cost-free. Rebuilding investor trust absorbs energy and requires policymakers to stabilize expectations when they could otherwise focus on strategy. These repeated cycles demand constant rebuilding of credibility. They demonstrate resilience, but also highlight how much energy is expended simply to return to baseline. The 2023-24 conflict reinforced this. Israel's normally stable stock market showed pronounced volatility. Domestic consumption dipped, exports slowed, and international perception of risk shifted. Analysts emphasize that Israel's agility still sets it apart, but the contraction highlighted the difference between enduring pressure and avoiding its impact altogether. Resilience reduces duration but does not prevent bruising losses in output and confidence. The same pattern recurs across every war in Israel's history: a dip, a contraction, a partial rebound and recovery, but each with costs that dig into long-term efficiency. The consistent thread across these examples is that the resilience narrative conceals the fact that every conflict carves scars. Tourism collapses cut billions in service revenue. Households hold back consumption, dampening domestic growth. New investment slows, starving startups of their rapid pace. Reserve call-ups drain labor capacity, stalling industries from agriculture to high-tech. And housing shortages deepen under paused construction. The state can absorb these strikes and resume growth, but the imprint remains. Israel thrives by bending under these pressures and returning to growth quickly, yet every test leaves lasting drag on what might otherwise have been smoother, steadier prosperity. Resilience then comes with a price tag. Quick rebounds show underlying strength, but they are never free. Every escalation imposes direct financial losses and secondary costs that accumulate over time. The cycle sustains Israel's prosperity but also limits its efficiency, as energy meant for expansion is diverted to stabilizing aftershocks. These recurring stresses shape not only the economy's numbers, but also the perception of what citizens are willing to bear in the name of security. And it is at this point that economic calculation intersects with social cohesion. The ability to absorb losses again and again relies not only on financial resilience, but also on a deeper understanding between the state and its citizens. That deeper bargain, what people are prepared to accept in exchange for security and prosperity, forms the core of Israel's next challenge. The social contract under strain. For decades, Israel's economy and society have rested on an implicit understanding often described as the social contract. Citizens accept high taxation, compulsory military service, and the constant threat of mobilization in return for the promise that their living standards will remain secure and broadly comparable to advanced nations. This trade-off has been central to keeping the country cohesive despite its unique pressures. As long as growth created visible improvements in everyday life, rising wages, expanding consumer options, and modern healthcare, the sacrifices could be justified. Prosperity was not only an outcome, but also a form of reassurance that endurance under conflict would be rewarded. The first signs of strain appear where prosperity is less tangible. Public services face growing pressure, and many Israelis notice it in ways statistical growth figures cannot conceal. Hospitals struggle with patient loads and staff shortages, even as defense budgets expand to cover new military technologies. Schools in some districts remain overcrowded, and teacher strikes over salaries surface repeatedly. Infrastructure tells a similar story. Israel's roads and rail networks lag behind the pace of economic and population growth, with Tel Aviv's transport system emblematic of promise delayed by competing priorities. Each of these examples conveys the same message to ordinary citizens. National wealth is real, but it does not always reach them in the form of reliable daily services. Housing has become the clearest fault line. Prices in urban centers, especially Tel Aviv, have climbed far beyond what most young families can afford. Even households with two strong earners, often in high-tech, struggle to buy property. Surveys of young Israelis consistently show deep frustration with this situation, with many identifying the cost of housing as one of the biggest reasons they consider emigrating. Imagine a young reservist, trained as an engineer and working at a promising startup, who is unable to buy into the very city where his industry thrives. He serves his country, pays high taxes, and helps generate record exports, but he cannot secure a stable home. This sense of misalignment fuels doubts about whether the social contract is still holding. Politics compounds perceptions of imbalance. Coalition governments dependent on ultra-Orthodox parties often preserve subsidies for religious education and provide extensive support to large families. While these allocations follow political compromises, many secular and economically active citizens see them as evidence that resources are disproportionately directed toward groups with lower labor force participation. The issue becomes more visible against the backdrop of high defense spending. Households watching health budgets strain or classrooms overcrowd can easily conclude that state resources are being split unequally between those who contribute heavily and those who contribute less. Whether that perception is fully fair or not, it feeds resentment. Conscription exemptions intensify these feelings. Large segments of the ultra-Orthodox community continue to be exempted from military service in order to focus on religious study. In earlier decades, when this group was smaller, the compromise drew less attention. But as their share of the population grows, so too has frustration with watching thousands of peers avoid the same obligations others must meet. Citizens shouldering reserve call-ups and service rotations see entire communities standing apart, supported by state subsidies, yet absent from one of Israel's most defining collective experiences. For a society that relies on the principle of shared burden, this is perceived by many as a breach of fairness. These inequalities are not only ethical debates but also practical challenges. Israel's defense system requires a broad manpower base to function. If a rising portion of the population is absent from both military service and high-value segments of the workforce, the pool of contributors shrinks while demands on them grow heavier. Over time, this imbalance could erode the capacity of Israel's defense readiness itself. In practice, it means that the social contract is tested not only in how people view fairness, but in the concrete ability of the country to sustain its military and fiscal commitments. Generational differences are sharpening these tensions. Younger Israelis facing high costs and repeated mobilizations feel the weight of obligations that seem disproportionately assigned. When services feel underfunded and opportunities out of reach, their willingness to accept constant military duties on top of heavy taxes diminishes. Some begin to look outward, seeking careers abroad where they can build stable lives without subsidizing populations that appear in their eyes to give less back. Research-backed commentary has noted that brain drain is not yet at crisis levels, but surveys increasingly capture dissatisfaction among the young. The risk is that each percentage point of lost talent comes disproportionately from the very sectors, technology, medicine, engineering, that sustain national growth. It would be misleading to suggest that this discontent dominates Israeli society at all times. Many citizens remain committed to service, while others express continued pride in the country's combination of military resilience and technological success. Yet the cracks make themselves known during moments of heightened pressure. A parent struggling to secure hospital care for their child, a teacher negotiating wages against a backdrop of rising defense allocations, or a young couple squeezed out of urban housing all confront daily evidence that prosperity is not evenly shared. Each confrontation with these realities places additional stress on the belief that sacrifice always leads to stability and reward. This is why the social contract matters far beyond abstract fairness. Israel's impressive economic numbers, GDP per capita, export records, investment flows, rest on the assumption that citizens will continue to uphold their side of the bargain. If more begin to feel that the contract no longer works for them, resilience could falter not from a lack of resources but from declining trust. A contract built on sacrifice and reward is only sustainable if both elements remain intact. Once perceptions change, resentment can spread quickly, taking an enduring strength of society and recasting it as a potential weakness. Ultimately, the endurance of Israel's economic model is tied not only to the presence of foreign aid or innovation, but to the daily conviction of its citizens that they are part of a fair system. The challenge is less about whether the economy can expand, it clearly can, and more about whether social cohesion will allow that expansion to remain politically and culturally viable. If service, taxation, and burdens feel unequally distributed, the legitimacy of the model comes under pressure. If citizens in critical sectors choose to disengage, whether through emigration or reduced willingness to shoulder obligations, the system could lose the very contributors who make prosperity possible. Israel's resilience has always been judged by its ability to absorb external shocks and return to growth. But society's endurance depends equally on trust inside its own borders. As frustrations mount over housing, shared service, and resource allocation, observers must ask whether the next decade will see this unwritten agreement hold steady or gradually erode under the weight of its contradictions. The stakes are high because these internal pressures will determine not only living standards, but Israel's long-term ability to remain both prosperous and balanced under relentless strain. Is the model truly sustainable? The question now is whether Israel's economic model, so resilient in the face of persistent conflict, is truly sustainable over the long run. On the surface, the achievements are undeniable. GDP per capita exceeds $55,000, defense exports consistently generate billions, and the technology sector produces nearly a fifth of national output while accounting for more than half of exports. Few other nations under such constant pressure present figures this strong. Yet the very conditions that make these numbers possible also reveal fragility. Sustainability rests not just on growth, but on whether the foundations supporting that growth endure. Externally, Israel's model depends in part on a strategic partnership with the United States. Since the late 1960s, Washington has provided military and economic aid worth hundreds of billions of dollars by some estimates. Today, U.S. assistance adds up to about $3.8 billion annually in direct financing, supplemented by missile defense cooperation and preferential terms in major procurement programs. In addition, American diplomatic cover at the United Nations has repeatedly blocked sanctions or resolutions that could have curtailed Israel's access to global markets. Investors and companies have long assumed this support is durable, but the relationship is political, not automatic. Changes in U.S. administrations or shifting domestic priorities in Washington could alter the scale or consistency of that backing. The strength of the model, therefore, is tied partly to an alliance that exists outside Israel's direct control. Internally, demographic pressures raise another layer of concern. The fastest-growing population groups, particularly the ultra-Orthodox community, have lower levels of workforce participation, especially among men. Many households prioritize religious study over skills aligned with the modern economy, while simultaneously maintaining the highest birth rates in the country. Over time, this combination increases fiscal demands and narrows the base of productive contributors. As long as high-tech sectors expand fast enough, the imbalance is absorbed. But if growth in those industries slows, the mismatch between contributors and dependents becomes harder to manage. Under these conditions, even modest declines in productivity could have disproportionate effects on fiscal stability. Housing affordability intensifies the strain. Real estate prices in cities like Tel Aviv rank among the highest in the world relative to income. Even dual-income households in high-tech sectors struggle to purchase apartments. This creates frustration among the very workers who sustain Israel's tax base, raising the risk of disillusionment or emigration. Coalitions reliant on ultra-Orthodox parties have often preserved subsidies for religious education and child allowances, but reforms intended to alleviate housing costs or broaden workforce participation remain politically difficult. As years pass without resolution, the structural pressures mount, even though headline GDP figures keep improving. Then there are the cyclical shocks caused by war itself. Resilience allows Israel to recover faster than most countries, but that recovery comes at a cost. The 2023-24 Gaza conflict offered a striking example. GDP contracted sharply in the quarter immediately following the October 7 attacks, with some estimates showing an annualized decline of nearly 20% before stabilization. Tourism collapsed, household consumption dipped, and investment slowed. Reserve mobilizations removed tens of thousands of workers from their jobs, delaying projects and reducing output. Recovery followed, but the process required immense financial and human resources. Each conflict leaves a scar, even if aggregate statistics later climb. Sustainability here means absorbing the repeated costs of rebuilding, which by definition limits resources available for long-term planning. The balance therefore comes into focus as three interlinked elements. First, external support. The United States financial aid and diplomatic umbrella remains a crucial but not guaranteed shield. Second, internal structural risks. Low labor force participation in fast-growing communities, rising housing costs, and political constraints impose steady, long-term stress. Third, cyclical shocks, from tourism collapses to reserve call-ups, create recurring economic interruptions that slow momentum. Together, these factors shape the context in which Israel's prosperity exists. The achievements are significant, but they are not cost-free nor automatically self-sustaining. For those asking what will determine the future, three indicators are especially important. The first is the trajectory of U.S. support. As long as American financing and diplomatic cover remain steady, Israel reduces its exposure to sudden fiscal shocks. If that support weakens, both defense outlays and investor confidence could be tested. The second indicator is workforce participation, particularly among ultra-Orthodox men and parts of the Arab population. Modest increases in participation and skills training could strengthen the country's long-term fiscal health. The third is housing affordability. If reforms can slow the upward spiral of costs, young professionals may remain engaged, keeping the innovation cycle intact. If not, brain drain becomes more likely, draining away precisely the talent that sustains Israel's competitive edge. The broader lesson is that Israel's economy is not an unbreakable paradox, but an engineered system calibrated around unusual circumstances. The system produces growth in conditions where almost any other nation would shrink, but it relies on levers that may shift: alliances abroad, population dynamics at home, and how often war interrupts daily life. Each of these is manageable in isolation, yet together they create uncertainty about the long-term trajectory. Sustainability depends less on immediate output and more on whether these underlying conditions remain aligned. The sobering truth is that Israel has proven it can design resilience out of conflict and scarcity, but whether that arrangement endures as circumstances evolve is an open question. Stability will hinge on how external guarantees and internal pressures interact in the years ahead. Israel may continue rising, or it may be forced into political and economic adjustments that reshape the model itself. The question now is not whether Israel's economy can grow under pressure. It has already demonstrated that. The question is whether it can continue to thrive when the buffers weaken and the internal strains intensify. Israel engineered resilience in war. The challenge is whether that design can last as conditions shift around it. Israel's prosperity is not accidental. It is a system built to channel conflict, scarcity, and uncertainty into engines of innovation and growth. But that design carries conditions. U.S. backing provides essential buffers, while demographics, housing costs, and political compromises create long-term strain. Recurring wars add cycles of disruption that cannot be ignored. The core takeaway is clear. Israel's wealth in wartime is engineered, not accidental, resilient, but conditionally so. Which part of Israel's resilience surprised you most? Tech, US support, or survival industries? Tell us below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Final image: a nation turning scarcity into exportable expertise. An advantage, but also its test.